მიხარია რომ ამდენ ადამიანს ვხედავ დღეს დარბაზში. დღევანდელი თემა ეძღვნება სოციალურ ტრანსფორმაციას კავშირის სამეზობლო პოლიტიკის ქვეყნებში. მე წარმოგიდგენთ მხოლოდ მოდერატორს, რომელიც შემდეგ წარმოგიდგენთ ჩვენ სტუმრებს დისკუსიის მონაწილეებს. ეს არის ამანდა პოლი, ევროპის პოლიტიკის კვლევის ცენტრიდან, ლონდონის ოფისიდან. მე მასალა გადავცემ სიტყვას და ის გადაცნობთ დანარჩენ სტუმრებს. კიდევ ერთხელ დიდი მადლობა მომხსენებისთვის.
Well, good evening. I won't hear myself in my own earphones. So good evening, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. It's a great pleasure to be in Tbilisi again, taking part in this European week. It's actually the first time I've been taking part in this week. For those of you who don't actually know me or the organisation, I'm working at European Policy Centre. It's a leading think tank in Brussels. And I'm covering a wide range of different issues, including the EU's Eastern Neighbourhood, the South Caucasus, the Caspian region, and also Turkey. And obviously within the context of our work on the EU's Eastern Neighbourhood, we're covering the EMP and the Eastern Partnership. Since then, the EU has definitely started to make up time. But of course, transforming this region is not an easy task. It's not something that will be happening very quickly or very easily, simply because the region, as we're all aware, is plagued by numerous different problems, and also it's captured still in its Soviet legacy. You also have the problem of other players in the region that continue to meddle, and no more so perhaps than the big neighbour, Russia. But tonight we're going to look at how successful or not the EMP has been in helping bring about social transformation in the South Caucasus, what has been achieved, what lessons have been learned, and what challenges lie ahead. And we have a very exciting panel with us here tonight to discuss these issues and give us their views. So I just quickly turn to the right page. If I can actually find the right page, sorry, yes. So we're going to start off with Jana Kobzova, who is from the European Council on Foreign Relations in the UK. She is going to be followed by Coffey from Heritage Foundation in the US, followed up by Wayne David from the UK, Member of Parliament, Shadow Constitutional Affairs Minister. And then finally by Thornike, Gordadze, Deputy Foreign Minister of Georgia. So please, Jana, I ask you to start. Thank you.
I was just thinking that if a panel starts at 7 o'clock on a workday, which is practically the end of workday, or half past 7 now, it usually means two things. It means that either the organizers think that the topic is so interesting and important that everybody's going to stick around, even though it's practically the end of the workday, or the topic is so hopeless that it doesn't matter if some of you fall asleep in the middle of my presentation. So thanks all again for coming. It's great to be in Tbilisi again. When I was preparing my presentation, I actually did the job of looking up the definition of social transformation, which I wanted to read out loud. So social transformation requires a shift in collective consciousness of a society, local, national, or global, so that reality is defined by consensus. Scientific discoveries have triggered many social transformations throughout our history, as have religious and royal edicts. Now, if you look at this definition, the EU probably doesn't have the power of either religious or royal edict, so the power is probably going to be very different. What I'm going to argue is basically that even though the EU has social transformation in its eastern neighborhood as one of its biggest objectives, when you look on the ground, you actually see that the gap between objective and the reality is widening, with few exceptions, like Moldova or Georgia. But in most cases, the gap is actually growing. And I think this is for a number of reasons. First of all, I'm not sure the neighborhood policy is actually well equipped to bring about any sort of social transformation. This usually comes within the societies. The EU neighborhood policy can help, can assist, can cushion some of the negative impacts of that transformation, but it cannot really initiate it. And as it looks now, it's basically the EU is using what it used in Central Europe before when it comes to neighborhood policy, albeit it's a little bit more diluted. As you all know, in Central Europe, the situation was the EU said to this reform, to that reform, political and economic, and in the end you'll join the EU. What the EU is offering to this neighborhood is basically asking for the same things without offering the EU membership perspective. Now the situation is also different for one more reason. When the EU started to have enlargement policy in Central and Eastern Europe, the social transformation was already going on. The EU didn't actually have to do much explanation in terms of explaining why is its social and economic model and political model and its values so important for the Central European countries to follow. Why is it important to embrace that model? And if I have to brutally simplify, I'd say that the EU actually could just more or less sit back, relax, disperse money, dispatch advisors, and wait until these members until these countries did their job and then change their societies and then let them in. I'm of course exaggerating, there were problems in Slovakia and so on, but the EU was able to use the carrot of membership in a way it's not able to use it in the neighborhood. The other thing is that what's also different in terms of promoting social transformation is that, well, as I said, in Central Europe, the countries were relatively enthusiastic about embracing the EU model. It's not the case in most of the Eastern Partnership countries. Apart from Moldova and Georgia, most of the leadership in these countries are actually not interested in embracing the kind of model the EU is talking about. The situation is also difficult for one more reason. 4 out of 6 countries face a territorial conflict, which not only inflicts trauma on the society, it also hampers the prospects for economic growth. And that has not been the case in Central Europe. Not to say the least that Russia's political, economic, cultural and security influence in the region is just very different from what it was in Central and Eastern Europe. Not only do we have a complicated situation, the EU actually lacks many of the partners it had in Central and Eastern Europe. Again, governments in Moldova or Georgia might be persuaded Euro enthusiasts, but that's not the case in other countries. We don't need to look anywhere else but Ukraine and Belarus to realize that these countries are not really keen to promote for the cooperation with the EU in a way the EU would like it to see. And so on. So actually the EU is used to deal with the governments, but in fact most of the governments in the region are not really interested in sort of promoting the deep social transformation the EU wants to see in the region. And if all of this wasn't enough, the EU itself is in a very difficult position with the political and economic crisis. And what that means is just one thing. EU has one set of taxpayers, and these taxpayers at the moment want to see much of the US money spent within the EU on growth, and they don't like their taxes being exported as aid to neighbors or anywhere else in the world. Now, especially in the countries which are showing that they're not really interested in changing the things that the EU wants them to change. So it's, the situation is difficult. EU is not stopping the help, actually the aid is increasing, but it's not going to be a sort of a huge, substantial increase that many of these countries would need to help with the transition they're going through. And actually, Amanda, you mentioned the more for more approach, but it's funny that the EU has polished this more for more approach at the times when the EU actually has fewer political resources to devote to the region. And it also cares less about the region than it was before because it's so much concentrated on what's going on inside the EU at the moment. Now, obviously, social transformation is going to take years. EU is only part of it. It comes from the society. The question, obviously, is what the EU should be doing. And I know that maybe it doesn't sound as it's connected, but I'm going to tell a joke, which I think tells a lot about what the EU should be doing. There are 3 generals, one from America, one from Germany, one from Russia. And they're arguing about whose army is the best. Now the Russian starts and says, our army is the best, we have the best equipment and our soldiers get 2,000 calories a day. The German general stands up and says, comrade, that's nothing. Our army is the best, because we give our soldiers 5,000 calories a day. Now the American general stands up and says, guys, this is nothing. Our army is of course the best, and our soldiers get 8,000 calories a day. The Russian general stands up and says, that's impossible, nobody can eat so many potatoes a day. Now, what's the point? The point is it's not about how much calories you get and how many calories you get, it's also what kind of calories you get. And that's the same with the neighborhood policy, right? You're only going to have some amount of funds. The question is how you're going to spend these funds and whom you're going to work with. And I think that's the key for neighborhood policy. If it wants to help promote the kind of social change and social transformation we have seen in Central Europe or elsewhere. It's basically engaging with people who want to be more like the EU, who want to have the same values, the same social and political model that the EU is promoting. Now, in some cases, it's the government. In cases like Belarus or Azerbaijan, it's probably someone else. It's probably the NGOs, it's probably the business community, it's probably the bureaucrats. It differs from country to country, but the point is the EU should look beyond the governments. If it sees that what it is doing has little effect on the social transformation in these countries. And obviously two things are very important. One of them is the Riemann-Comprehensive Agreement on the free trade. The other one is visa liberalization, because these two things not only deepen the ties with the EU, but also help to promote sort of deeper changes within these societies. And they also, importantly, I think, they in the midterm benefit the middle class, which actually can initiate and sustain the change toward democracy. I'll just add up on one thing. I think that sort of the region of Eastern Partnership is changing. And in many ways, the change is actually not so good if you're in countries like Armenia or Azerbaijan or Belarus. But at the same time, the EU is sort of less caring, not less caring, but it just has fewer resources to devote to the region. But at the same time, what's happening is basically attempts to reconsolidate power. And the problem is that if the EU accepts this as a new normal, it's going to create enormous problems for the EU in the long term. We just have to need to look at North Africa or Middle East to see what kind of problems this sort of acceptance of authoritarianism has brought to the EU. So the increase of calories is not going to work. It's actually the funds are limited and that's not going to happen. We need to think about how to use these funds, for the benefit of the societies, both in the EU and Eastern neighborhood. After all, every army is not only made up of generals, it's made up of soldiers who need the best to perform well. And I think that's the task the EU has if it wants to sort of enhance the social transformation in the region.
I would agree actually with most of exactly what you said. I think the ENP and the EAP are both sort of half-cooked policies. The EU has never had any proper strategy to this entire region. And I think perhaps that's part of the reason why Ukraine is perhaps in the situation where it's at today. It's certainly not 100% to blame on Ukraine for where it's at. But I would just like to say a word about Armenia, because I do actually think that the EU's policies towards Armenia, particularly in the recent times, have been quite positive, and that there have been a number of significant positive developments in Armenia. We just had elections there that were definitely a step forward, and also in a number of other social areas. So now we're going to move to our second speaker from the Heritage Foundation, Mr. Coffey. Please, floor is yours.
Thank you. And thanks to Europe House and for all the sponsors who have made, who's making this week possible. I said earlier during some interviews that I thought Europe Week was a great opportunity for Europeans to learn more about Georgia and for Georgia to learn a bit more about Europe as well, because at the end of the day, Georgia, I believe, largely speaking, is historically, geographically, and culturally European country. And without a doubt, Georgia's future is in the European Union and also in NATO. I will probably take a slightly different view, perhaps, simply because I'm not a European, I'm American, although I have lived in Europe for the last decade before recently returning back to the U.S., and I love Europe. I love all things European in the geographical sense.